Morning all, let's have a look at the clash between Luke McShane playing white and Magnus Carlsen playing black in round 1 of the London Chess Classic. So in 2010 Luke had managed to beat Magnus Carlsen. In 2011 it was a draw. The 2010 game was actually quite brilliant. It was an English opening, so was an English opening about to be repeated here today, or rather yesterday when the game was played. So E4 actually was played, not the English opening C4, and Magnus elects a very solid system called the Berlin defense, which is the system which Vladimir Kramnik used to take down Garry Kasparov in their London Brain Games match. So the Berlin, ultra solid, taking on E4 here, knight D6, knight takes E5, bishop E7. You'll notice that the pawn structure is symmetrical for the moment. Bishop F1, and now the usual move statistically in this position is knight takes E5, but so knight takes E5, for example, taking, and we have this kind of situation which is solid enough for black, but no, Magnus actually chooses in this position the move knight F5. And actually checking this out on chessgames.com, this move knight F5 has got a good record statistically. Okay, so slightly off the most beaten track, but nevertheless an interesting move. Luke plays knight F3 now, so he's exploiting the fact that the knight hasn't been taken. So is there more tension than usual in the position here? After castles D4, D5, well, it's not as shall we say, dull as usual with extra pieces on the board, you might think, but it is a symmetrical structure. This next move, G3, would seem to be committing some light square weaknesses, and maybe the bishop wants to hang around to kind of make sure they don't become a problem. Bishop F6, C3, and is this bishop really going to be useful in this type of position? We'll see. An exchange of rooks now is invited, and that's accepted. Rook takes E8, bishop F4 attacking C7, and the queen humbly goes back to protect C7 in this position. Now bishop D3, and it looks as though, okay, the bishop doesn't have to go to G2, it's more aggressive on this diagonal. F5 might be unstable at some point. Knight Fe7, getting out of the firing line, and maybe knight G6 is going to be useful, hitting the bishop on F4. And now we see knight A3. The knight looks to be heading centrally like this to put more pressure on D5 and F5. A6, knight C2. Well, actually, I think with A6, an implied threat might also have been just knight B5 as well. Pardon me, because otherwise why would Magnus want to play A6? So it's not just a pretty route, it's a tempo gaining route to get to F3. C7 is actually a bit of a problem in this position, especially with the bishop here. What can actually protect C7? Okay, so that probably explains A6 here. It was a major threat actually in that particular position. So knight C2, bishop F5. Is it good for black to get rid of these light square bishops? Okay, bishop takes F5, knight takes F5. And now you might think this next move is quite surprising. It certainly woke up many of the spectators. I was watching this on a very interesting site for watching tournaments called Chess Bomb. It's got interactive engine analysis while you're spectating, and this next move took quite a lot of people by surprise, including me. I wonder if you can spot it. If I give you 10 seconds now, what did white play in this position? And all of a sudden everyone started paying more attention to this game in particular. Okay, white played G4, forcing move, but surely weakening a bit white's king side, you might ask. Well, if these weaknesses can't be exploited, then maybe it's not a problem, but in principle there's a potential isolated pawn issue. If this pawn ever gets dissolved, say even tactically, if the pawn ever gets dissolved, there's isolated pawn issue, leaving black with potentially better pawn structure. That's something to be borne in mind as well. It's not just about the immediate weaknesses or the king's safety, it's the isolation of pawns, the potential for the isolation of these pawns, which could be an issue later. The knight retreats for a moment. Now g5 doesn't win a piece because there's knight g6 hitting that in return, but I think Nigel Short, one of the official commentators for the match on the official live stream, was indicating as though g5 would be interesting to play here nevertheless, and that's something we should really check out as a forcing move in this position in the second pass through this game. For the moment, knight e3 was played, putting more pressure on d5, g6, ruling out the use of f5 as well from white, queen f1, and for the moment it seems as though white has a very pleasant position here for the moment, because ideas like queen h3 could be used as a battery on that c7 pawn again. Poor c7 is a victim in this sort of position, unless this knight can move out of the way for c6 at some point. Queen d7, queen h3, bishop g7. Now queen g3 is employed. Rook c8, humbly defending c7 again. And now g5, which marks out the dark squares, and at this point technically white was actually better according to all the engines, and this next move seems entirely logical. A kind of weakness of the last move to be pounced on, that black has neglected e5 for this one moment, and here bishop e5 pounces on e5. So is Magnus in trouble? Some people thought Magnus was in trouble here at this point now. Okay, knight e6. Will Magnus go down, or will he rescue the situation? Will he come back with a vengeance from this seemingly passive position? Well, okay, so knight e6, putting pressure on d4 and g5 potentially, and also potentially supporting c5. So the knight on e6 looks particularly quite useful, but bishop f6 has a menacing threat now introduced of knight e5. And in fact, after rook e8, we do see knight e5. Okay, queen goes to d6. I think engines were recommending queen b5. Taking away the queen from king safety seems like a bad idea in principle. Queen d6 seems a more principled move, keeping the queen around. And okay, and this is a really critical moment here, and there's actually a kind of invisible threat in this position that black has, which it's really difficult to get a clue when you're presented with engine analysis. What is black actually threatening? Would you be able to answer the question here? What is black actually threatening in this position, and why would this? What would you play here as white? If I give you 10 seconds, what would you play here as white, and what is black threatening? Think about the position. Very interesting. Starting from now. Okay, it seems this move, queen d6, wasn't just a positional move, as a lot of positional moves which seem to be positional moves are not in Grandmaster games. There's actually a tactical point to it, that actually knight takes g5, believe it or not, is actually a potential technical threat, and we see that unveiled in the game. So that's probably why, well, I had presumed that was why, incorrectly. It's difficult without actually on the online analysis to actually understand the multiple threats that black has, but I'd assumed actually h4 was being prompted for a different reason, a very different reason, to do with playing h5, and to do with generally being able to maybe answer h5 from black with something as well. But no, h4 is actually reinforcing g5, and I think white would be still doing very well here. But now it seems, instead of that, the move king h1 allows this invisible tactic. So what is the point of this tactic? Knight takes g5 was actually played. The immediate point, well, if bishop takes e7, then I assume queen takes e7, that's fine for black. If queen takes g5, then queen takes f6. So this move bishop takes g5 was played, and now the point is revealed f6. What can white do now? And as I mentioned before, if there's a problem with this g pawn, white is basically in effect isolated these two pawns. The structure isn't as intact. If we compare pawn structures now, white decides not to play bishop f4, but I'm not sure if that's any good anyway. He plays actually bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, and if we do a pawn structure comparison, this isn't as good as this structure, but is this bishop going to be good in this endgame compared to one of white's knights? Does white have pressure on d5, or is c6 just going to bolster the centre? That's the first thing Magnus does actually. After rook e1, he bolsters his centre with c6. King g2, and now are we in for a Magnus grind? He's known for long, torturous endgames, making his games very difficult for commentators in magazines and newspapers and video annotators to try and analyse the just very, very long, torturous journeys. But here, okay, let's try and see what are his plans in this position. This next move, knight c8, seems like a neat rerouting idea for the knight to influence the centre, or use f5, either of those squares. Okay, knight 3 g4, attacking the queen. Queen just simply drops back. There's a calmness with Magnus's moves and kind of cheeky kind of provocation, you know. But why not? There's nothing going on now. White hasn't got too many opportunities here, it seems, to build up pressure. He plays knight d3, inviting an exchange of rooks, and that is actually taken. Knight d6, okay. Knight d3. White seems to have control of e5, but knight f5 now. Now, of course, actually the disastrous queen f3 does knight h4 just shows that white's already a little bit worse. In fact, I think an engine recommendation this move looked outrageous to play h3 with the outrageous idea of queen h2, but maybe it is one of the better possibilities just to keep the queen on this diagonal. Okay, so in the game we saw queen h3 here, bishop f8, and now, well, black's going to get that diagonal anyway with a bishop. That's his next strategic operation, potentially. Knight e3 offering another exchange of pieces, but check. And now this other exchange of pieces is also gladly accepted. So knight takes, f takes. Is the advantage becoming too small? There are two ways of capturing back there. White didn't fancy queen takes e3. We'll check that out in the second pass, I think. King g7, knight f4. Okay, immediately threatening knight e6, of course. Queen f6, pinning the knights, king e2, and now bishop d6. Black seems to be getting the better of it slightly, intuitively. Queen g4, although knight h5 is now a concrete threat on the board. That's dealt with king f7, h3, h5, and of course Magnus has a 2-to-1 pawn majority here. So fundamentally, you could say he's better based on the pawn structure. But what about queen c8? Concrete threats have to be parried all the time as well. So queen e7, knight d3. Can black actually make use of his 2-to-1 pawn majority? Well, this next move is a bit of a stunner in its own right, to do with the 2-to-1 pawn majority. What would you play here as black if I give you 10 seconds? starting from now. Okay, I'll give you a clue. Black's dark square control is good in this position. White hasn't got a dark square bishop, just this knight. If the dark square control is good, often it affords you more operations on dark squares, and there's a particularly outrageous strategic operation that black has at his disposal, which he makes use of. King f6, the king simply gliding down the dark squares. He's starting to put pressure on h3. White's already on time pressure at this time. But if a king comes down to h4, it could start to get very unpleasant. This 2-to-1 pawn majority, especially if this drops, this is going to be really dangerous. What can White do? It's this backward pawn's not helping matters. It's nullifying White's extra pawn in the centre, this backward pawn as well. So what was a slight structural advantage, even though White repaired his structure in theory, there's still a fundamental implication of a passed pawn potential, that black has the 2-to-1 now, and White's extra pawn in the centre is nullified. So that if black can get away with this strategic operation, which he does, what can White do about it? He's just staring at this king coming down to h4 now. It's torture. A la Magnus. c5, okay. The bishop just installs itself on g3, protecting even f2 now. b4. White's trying to maybe play a kind of minority attack to fracture the structure, to isolate some pawns. Is it quick enough? Queen f7 is played. What does this do? Well, maybe it kind of ties down the knight, because queen f2's. Also queen f5, just to interfere with the queen's protection of h3. If this drops, then these pawns are going to march forward. a4. Queen f5 isn't employed here. In fact, g5, king d2, and now another remarkable endgame move. Remarkable. What does black play here? Factoring in technical nuances and annoying moves from White, guess what black plays here to emphasize more king aggression in this position? The queen also kind of protected f2, meaning that the bishop might be free to move. That's a clue. So if I give you 10 seconds now, what would you play here with black? Okay. Bishop h2. I think a move like g4 could be answerable with taking and maybe a nuisance check. So if the king comes to g3 instead, why not? Get out of these checks. Knight e1, king g3. This is really powerful endgame stuff from Magnus, putting on huge pressure. Knight c2, bishop g1. Is e3 also a target? For the moment it's adequately defended. Queen d8. Magnus takes his time. No rush here to play g4. You might think there's a rush to play g4 in this position, given that's attacked. Given the history of the game, this becomes their remarkable move. A very remarkable, patient move is played. With g5 under fire, you might think g4. King h3 doesn't seem at all good. That would just blow things surely. But this move is just patiently going back, stepping back for a moment, and asking White, well, what are you doing now? Are you really playing this minority attack? Really? With e3 as a liability? If this knight ever dares to move, then queen f2, and e3 will drop. So it's asking White the question, what is White doing here? We see queen c8. And now progress is an alteration now with bishop f2 instead of king g3. Trying bishop f2. Probing White. What will White do to bishop f2? White plays king e2, and now we see king g3. Okay. If any check, maybe just king g2, possibly. Queen d8 is played. Trying to be a nuisance again, but now queen f5 protects and attacks. And also h3 is on. This looks pretty nasty stuff. King d2. And in this position, king takes h3. Oh dear. It's two connected passed pawns time. b5, g4. This g pawn in particular looks a very fast candidate passed pawn. White takes on c6 and plays knight b4. Is it too slow to win this c6? This is going to be a slow process to try and make use of the c pawn with this g pawn just here. g3. White plays knight d3, and it doesn't really delay things here. Just the move g2 is played, not fearing anything. Here White resigned. If knight f4, I guess queen takes f4 might be possible, just the queen again. But let's check now in this second pass. So it was a very determined effort from Magnus Carlsen to win this first game and to just grind White down using his fundamental structural advantages, which were transformed from isolated pawns into passed pawn potential, with White having the backward pawn not able to use the extra pawn in the centre. But this fine manoeuvring with the king along the dark squares, surfing on the wave of the dark squares really, which was possible with that dark square bishop, just getting the king so aggressively down here, supporting and herding these passed pawns, makes this, I think, quite instructive technique game. But let's check here with an engine. So knight f4, I think just queen takes f4, and then just queening is fine. Checks will run out. So okay, it got to critical proportions. Let's check from the start and let's flip the board. Congratulations, Magnus. So, beating the British #1, Luke McShane is currently the British #1 on Pheno rating, ahead of Michael Adams. So, okay, so bishop b5, we saw the very solid Berlin wall. The opening in that took down Kasparov in a critical Brain Games match in London. Okay, so knight f5, not as usual as knight takes e5. So knight f5, is this going to be increased in popularity after this game, this move knight f5? So we saw knight f3, castles d4 d5, and move g3. For a while it seemed White had a good grip on the position, so it's difficult to really be negative about this. Just although the final outcome of the game was bad for White, but it seems, you know, I'm pretty sure White had a technical advantage here. So the move knight a3, definitely, if we do a threat analysis here, I think the threat is really knight b5. Knight b5 is like one of the key threats. Okay, well, maybe not such a significant threat. Maybe there's some extra resourcefulness Black has as well. But okay, so Black chose a6, knight c2, bishop f5. So White's slightly better here. Now this move g4, a bit controversial maybe, g4. Just in principle it's controversial. If anything happens to the g pawn, as I say tactically, then White's isolated pawns. And then as we saw in the game, even if he repaired the structure with f takes e later, we end up with a 2-to-1 pawn majority like in the game. So the move g4 was profoundly a bit of a risk, a strategic risk. But tactically, what is going on? You know, black's having to face concrete tactical issues. Now, this first one, which was emphasised by Nigel Short in the commentary room yesterday, was G5. So let's have a look at G5. I don't think the engines at the time were screaming about G5. Knight G6. And let's play bishop takes C7. A forcing move. Okay. Queen takes C7. Netting a pawn, but G takes F6. White's compromised control of F4 here, and also there's a potential G file to make use of with this rook. So it looks as though, let's go with G takes F6. And look at this position. Was this an opportunity missed? Let's go with knight Fe1. So just try and maybe contest F4. So knight F4, knight E3, knight E7, queen F3. Also provide queen F3. That's another major point. Queen D6. King H1, King H8, Knight 1 to G2. Okay, we're far from the game. We're just checking this out, but it looks playable. It does look playable for white. Taking on C7 is profoundly important for structure, for D5 to be a target in this position. This looks pleasant for white. There's no real G-file problem. If there's no real G-file problem, actually white structure is better here with this isolated pawn. So that might have been quite interesting as a forcing sequence, to play the lottery here of playing the forcing move G5. Let's go back and look at that again. Was this a missed opportunity, G5? It does force knight G6. I mean, we can say that, there's nothing else. So this is absolutely forced. Bishop takes C7, absolutely forced. We have to take the bishop, otherwise we're just losing F6. So taking on F6, G takes. So the key thing here is, well, is this forced? Queen F4 takes, check. Now if this gets tricky here, if King H1, Queen E4, maybe Magnus has seen something like this. It's just, he just uses this pawn sack. He's about equal here. Does anything really change the picture fundamentally? It looks as though white's king safety is compromised. Actually, this doesn't seem a problem now at all. This variation, just make it into a pawn sack, and it's really quite dangerous with knight F4 on the cards. Surely. There's also rook E6. It looks like slaughter time, really. I'm not sure how white's actually surviving this. But yeah, from an engine point of view, it doesn't really have any emotions. It doesn't really care about this position. But yeah, it's technically, it should be absolutely fine for black. So really, okay, maybe this is why this forcing sequence is not so hot with G5. So basically, the move here, which might be quite powerful, is Queen F4. Queen F4. Alright, so let's go back into the game. So we see knight E3, G6, and Queen F1. White still has an edge at the moment. Queen G3, tying black down to C7. Move G5 now. Okay, knight D8, and we see bishop E5. Engines like bishop E5 here. Just, it looks logical enough to try and maybe weaken black's king or the dark squares in general. to play bishop e5, but knight e6 carries some venom with it. Okay, it is putting pressure on white on d4 and g5. So from a fundamental point of view, if there's a tactic on g5, these pawns will be isolated, as mentioned earlier. Rook e8 is played. Is white's best just to get rid of this potential tactical liability? As we saw in retrospect, it was a tactical liability, so could he just take on g7? Maybe, or h4 here. But white plays knight e5, it looks tempting enough. So here is where it seems as though h4 is needed. What are black's threats? That's the question. Let's do a threat analysis. Knight takes g5 is the primary threat. And this was very, very difficult to make out from just looking at engine analysis during the chess bomb coverage, that actually why is h4, what's the point of h4? If it's actually to safeguard g5, it was kind of invisible to quite a few people, including myself, to be quite honest, that knight takes g5. It's a subtle threat. I tried to determine from other variations that h5 was actually a threat here, to make use of that loose bishop as well, and maybe h4 had something to do with h5, but I don't think that's the case at all. If we play h4 h5, white cannot use en passant because the bishop's hanging. Of course, you just take the bishop. So the principal idea of h4 is to just reinforce g5 here, and it seems to leave white with some sort of advantage. Okay, so Magnus seems to be in retrospect let off the hook here. Let's just try taking on f6 here, for example. Takes. This wouldn't be hot because I think this will go splat now with knight f5, black's position. Check. Ouch. Disaster. So if that can't be taken, what does black do here? It's a bit of a shame, isn't it? h4, yes, it's just one prophylaxis move against the key threat is very important often, especially if bishop f6 is smashed up quite easily in this position. So we see a slip up with king h1 and the evaluation just drops totally. Black's almost even a tiny bit better technically. Knight takes g5, but fundamentally black looks visually better with the structure here. So f6, what are white's choices here? Let's imagine knight takes g6 as an option. Knight takes g6, bishop h4, queen d7. What is going on here? I think black now has a threat of rook e4. Let's have a look at that. Rook e4 is the principal threat here to embarrass the bishop. So let's go with rook g1, rook e4, knight g2, forcing move, knight takes, very forcing, and white's forced to play f3 here, otherwise he's going to lose his queen. So rook takes g1, loses his queen. So this starts to get into very dangerous territory for white. Okay, so if we go back, knight takes g6 doesn't seem that playable. What about bishop f4? Takes, bishop takes, this position. Bishop takes e5. It seems to leave white with a liability on e5 though. Is this better than the game? Let's go with queen b6, d4, knight f5, Now if knight f6, we just take that, I guess. So queen f4, and again black looks slightly better. Okay, so in the game, after this f6, it's a tense moment. White just plays bishop takes f6. So structurally black is now better. And yeah, I mean this looks an awkward position. I mean, or it looks as though white's drifting here into an awkward position. Exchange of rooks, okay, you might think relieves the pressure and gives black minimal winning chances, but Magnus is very, very determined. I think he sees his prospects of the 2-to-1 pawn majority now, so he's got that longer term plan in action, navigating the basic tactical threats, and the 2-to-1 starts to kick into action a little bit more. Now there's king f6. I think this is beyond engines, this sort of stuff. King f6. I think an engine would be worried about king safety, factoring it in to engine evaluation, but Magnus realises, I think, white's going to be in real trouble if this king gets super aggressive down the board there to herd the pawns. King f6, very, very powerful move, it seems. It's I don't know, genius at work. I don't know. This gliding down the dark squares. Okay, so black is pronouncing an advantage here slowly. What is the principal threat in this position for black after queen f7? Not queen h7, surely. Queen h7 does imply g5, if that's any use. Okay, that wasn't too helpful there. Let's carry on. It looks absurd to play queen h7. Okay. I think queen f5 probably doesn't help black. Let's see queen f5. Why would it be blunder? Taking. White would be too quick maybe with the c pawn here, smashing through. c6, and white's pass pawn is far too quick, I think. Well, it's not as good as the game anyway. So so g5 resisting such temptation. Queen f5. Bishop h2 now, so that seems the king is getting even more menacing now. Even the engine likes, I think, the king's position here. King does take time to go back, not taking on h3. Wants to keep those two pawns intact. Looks like the right thing to do in principle, keep the two pawns intact. Bishop f2. King g3 again now. So here, if queen b8, I would suspect king g2. Pardon me, just take the pawn here, of course. Forget king g2, just take the pawn. White's got to guard that pawn continually now, so that's one of the major points. This king is tying down the whole queen. So queen d8, queen f5 now is, we're looking at a +4. So why is that all of a sudden +4 when in this position it wasn't so bad? Okay, let's keep control of f5 here and play a5. Let's imagine a5, g4. This passed pawn is looking pretty dangerous. It's going to be winning, isn't it, this passed pawn? White could try being a nuisance. Queen e8 holds onto h5 as well as e4 now. It's threatened. It's deteriorating quickly now for white. So this is really unpleasant. This king on g3 clearly. So white's cracked is now it looks very concretely bad. So king comes to defend the knight here. If the knight moved, say to e1, we just take and then take here. Okay, so I think this is now really, really bad. This g pawn is just simply too quick. Too quick. And here white resigned. So what we've witnessed here is a Magnus grind. He can really torture opponents in endgames, and I certainly would not relish playing such an opponent, especially on increment, where the torture can last for hours and hours and hours. I don't know about you guys, but okay, this was fine technique though, and well done, Magnus. And with this win, apparently he's equalled the all-time FIDE rating height of Garry Kasparov at this moment in time. So that's a statistical record achieved with this win, I believe. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.